Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us virtually for the second installment of this crucial webinar series, which is presented in partnership with CyberWell and the Henry Jackson Society. The Florida Holocaust Museum is deeply grateful to the teams at CyberWell and the Henry Jackson Society for putting together such valuable and thoughtful programming for us, which is so badly needed during this time. Today's program will include a presentation by Dr. Helena Ivanov, followed by a Q&A. Please type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen, and we will do our best to address as many as we can within the time allowed. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our two panelists for today's session, Dr. Helena Ivanov and Mike Eagle. Helena is an Associate Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. She recently completed a PhD in International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her research focuses on the relationship between propaganda and violence against civilians. In her thesis, Helena examined the role propaganda played during the Yugoslav Wars and produced a model for studying propaganda, which details the key phases, functions, discourses, and techniques of propaganda. Additionally, Helena also served as manager at the Center for International Studies at the London School of Economics. Prior to her PhD, Helena completed a Master's of Philosophy and Political Theory at the University of Oxford and holds a BA in Politics from the University of Belgrade. Mike Eagle is the interim CEO and board chair emeritus at the Florida Holocaust Museum and chair of the Florida Commissioner of Education's Task Force on Holocaust Education. The grandson of Holocaust survivors, Mike frequently speaks about his family's experience and has seen firsthand how Holocaust education improves the world. Mike, over to you.
Thanks so much, Miranda, and thanks everyone for being here today. Last time we just talked introductorily, in the introduction, we talked briefly about sort of that idea of how the Holocaust served as a blueprint for the use of propaganda and its horrible dangers, particularly as it relates to anti-Semitism. And we used, a comparison, for example, of these newspapers like Der Stürmer that were used in how TikTok and other forms of social media are today's example of the exact same thing. Of course, continuing to keep that in mind, I'm hoping that a lot of people, think as they're listening to today's session, you have this this intuition when you're listening to this, where you're thinking, wow, if only people had the knowledge now, then that we have now, the outcome might have been different. Well, perhaps, but that is now it's happening again. Not necessarily even the genocide as it relates to the Holocaust, but these soup ingredients that I keep talking about, they are happening again and they continue to happen. And so you do now have the opportunity to learn and to learn the intricacies. And that's why we're doing this, is learning, really ripping the cover off and educating people in the sort of the inner workings of propaganda. So you will know it when you see it. So you will be able to assist in combating it, because as we've said, it's going to take one person at a time. It's another one of those Holocaust lessons. And so I'm hoping that everyone is thinking about that, the sort of parallel line between what was done by perpetrators, what wasn't done by bystanders, and we can learn from that. And that is exactly what this series is designed to do. So please bear that in mind as a context as we're listening to Dr. Ivanov. So I'll turn it over to her.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I will present some bits and pieces of the research that I've conducted during my master's and during my PhD, mainly discussing what is actually disinformation, how is disinformation different from, for example, propaganda, which is a broader concept, or misinformation, another important concept of contemporary times. I will walk you through some of the techniques that people who disseminate disinformation use in order to make their disinformation appear as more persuasive. I will also discuss the mechanisms through which disinformation appears to impact people's views and people's behavior, and of course, at the extreme, people's willingness to engage in violence against civilians or support violence committed by their regimes. And then finally, I'm going to walk you through a few helpful steps that could help you both recognize disinformation and then also combat disinformation. And as you will see when I go through those techniques, we can all fall victim to disinformation, no matter how much effort we put into staying well informed and knowing the truth. Disinformation is so omnipresent, it is so overwhelming, and the techniques that people are using are so sophisticated that no one is really immune. So I'm hoping that these few steps that I'm going to talk about will be helpful for you when you read the news, so that you know what you need to do to protect yourself from disinformation. And then simultaneously, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the techniques that you can use to combat disinformation. And as you will come to see, a lot of that will have to do with you moderating your own behavior. Obviously, some of it is going to be how you interact with other people, specifically people who believe fake news. But there is a lot of things that you right here, right now, can do to stop the spreading of disinformation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Just very briefly on where my interest comes from. So I was born and raised and spent most of my life living in Belgrade. And maybe some of you know that former Yugoslavia violently fell apart between 1991 and 1995. I was very, very small back then, but my mom was a journalist. She was a very strong oppositional journalist against the Milosevic's authoritarian regime at the time. And I kind of experienced firsthand through my childhood and then growing up just how much media and propaganda and disinformation can turn ordinary, normal people into people who support very evil things, into people who are willing to engage in violence against civilians, completely unjustifiable, illegitimate violence against civilians, or at the very least, support violence that is allegedly committed in their name. To me, that became fascinating, which is why I went on to study at Oxford, where I've studied the role of dehumanization in genocide. My two case studies were the dehumanization of Jews in Nazi Germany and the dehumanization of Bosnian Muslims in Bosnia. And then I expanded that research and basically went to do a PhD in international relations, and that brought me to study the concept of propaganda. And here I'll slowly start sharing my screen so that you can see the presentation. And as I started studying during my PhD, one very surprising thing emerged, which is everybody around me, like ordinary people, politicians, media outlets, everybody was on board with this idea that propaganda and disinformation can impact people's views and behavior, can motivate people to engage in violence, can motivate people to support violence. But when you look into the academic scholarship and academic literature, that consensus was lacking. There were many scholars who were arguing that propaganda doesn't have a huge impact. It has a marginal effect on people's willingness to engage in violence, that other things play a way more important role. Scholars have even reached completely mutually exclusive conclusions. To give you an illustrative example, two academics, very prominent academics, have done research on the role of RTLM, a major radio station, in Rwandan genocide in 1994. One academic has reached a conclusion that RTLM played a very marginal role in what happened in Rwanda, whereas the other academic has reached a conclusion that as many as 50,000 lives could have been saved had the international community jammed RTLM's transmitters. That's ultimately what led me to study propaganda. And in my thesis, I have reached a conclusion that propaganda absolutely does play a huge role in motivating violence. It has several mechanisms through which it can change how people perceive violence, and just generally it can change people's views, people's behavior, people's perceptions about politics. And to this day, I remain absolutely fascinated with this concept, and specifically how propaganda shapes people's views and behavior. During my time and still at Henry Jackson Society, I've done quite a few projects on how disinformation spreads, how specifically anti-Semitic disinformation spreads across university campuses, and how it impacts the very concerning rise of anti-Semitism that we're now witnessing across UK campuses and also across US campuses. So that's sort of like who I am, what my background is, and what I'm interested in. And in this workshop, I specifically want to focus on one concept, and that concept is disinformation. Now, to start us off, I believe it's important to define what is disinformation. And disinformation is the deliberate creation and dissemination of false and or manipulated information with the intent to deceive and or mislead. And here I would call you to pay attention to the fact that there is false information and then manipulated information, which is something that is very often the case with disinformation, where people will take something which is true, then reshape it beyond recognition, leaving grains of truth, like traces of truth there, and then disseminate it. And those grains of truth are often what will make people believe that disinformation, because the original accurate thing has been manipulated. Broadly speaking, and importantly, there are three key criteria of disinformation. The first one is deception. The second one is potential for harm. And the third one is the intent to harm. So basically, that means that perpetrators must deliberately intend to mislead. They need to, whoever disseminates disinformation has the intention to disseminate that disinformation. So basically, there is no such a thing as accidental disinformation. That would be misinformation. Sharing of non-deceptive but deliberately harmful messages like slurs based on race, class, gender, religion, or anything else is also not disinformation. So those are the three key criteria that you should be having in mind when specifically talking about disinformation. In terms of other relevant concepts that you should also be aware of is misinformation, which is verifiably false information that is shared, but there is no intent to mislead. And then obviously there is the concept that I have studied, which includes disinformation, but is much broader than that, which is propaganda. I should mention here that there are many, many different definitions of propaganda. This is the one that I have decided to rely on because I think it captures the concept quite well. It's written by Jowett and O'Donnell, and it defines propaganda as the deliberate, systemic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behavior to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. So in a very similar way, propaganda also includes this element of intent, and it is targeted to basically change what people think or to change how people behave. Now, going into the strategies of disinformation. Obviously, disinformation can be spread anywhere. It can be spread on social media platforms. It can be spread on TV. It can be spread on radio. It can be spread in a normal conversation. It can be spread in a lecture, class, seminar, workplace. Any place that exists in this world where humans are interacting with one another, disinformation can be spread. And unfortunately, in modern day and age, it is spread. But what are the strategies? Like how people actually do that? Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is a list that I have arrived to during my PhD, where I have sort of tried to, by watching many different instances of disinformation and many different instances of propaganda, my ultimate aim was to try and create this framework, this model for studying propaganda that would make it easier for scholars to identify disinformation when they see it and to understand disinformation when they encounter it. And I've basically arrived to 5 broad strategies that media outlets or regimes or a random person sitting behind a Twitter account who spreads disinformation could use. The first one is just inventing. That is literally making stuff up that have never happened. For example, in November 2023, a lot of disinformation started circulating online, how Jews were responsible for 9/11 attacks. We all know that's not true. We all know this is completely fake news. That is just a piece of information that has been invented. It's been placed out there. Sometimes those kinds of things become viral. Sometimes they don't become viral. But basically, this is something which is completely fake. There is no grain of truth. Someone made the story up and shared it out there with obviously the intention to deceive. The second strategy can be agenda setting. And this is something which is far more relevant in the context of major media outlets. Agenda setting basically means that when you are preparing a short evening daily news broadcast, you are basically deciding which news will you put where, how much time are you going to give to each of those news. And sometimes disinformation can work by placing the news in specific sections or shortening them or lengthening them in order to make you think that some issue is more important or that some issue is less important. And basically through agenda setting, I can give you an illustrative example from the Yugoslav Wars. In 1991, as the Serb-Croatian War was basically in its peak, and the Serbian forces were making far bigger advances at the time, the radio and television of Serbia, which was the Serbia's national broadcaster at the time, would usually devote around 80% of their evening daily news broadcast to everything that was happening in Croatia. A lot of that time was used to basically justify the violence that the Serbian forces were committing in Croatia by portraying that violence as some form of self-defense, or by portraying that violence as the only way to protect the Serbs who live in Croatia at the time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for an ordinary viewer, this was something which was really important, really big. This is where our attention needs to be. Fast forward to 1995, when basically Serbia's international and military and all other positions have been completely annihilated and devastated. And Croatian forces are now making serious advances in Croatia. And a lot of the Serbs who live in Croatia were forced to flee their homes and go to Serbia. You would have assumed this is going to be big news for the Serbia's national broadcaster. However, at the time, Milosevic's regime really wanted that war to end as soon as possible, and really wanted people to not know what was going on at the war front. So as 200,000 Serbs were forced to flee their homes during the Operation Storm that took place in 1995, RTS only broadcasted around 2 minutes, devoted only 2 minutes of its airtime to these news, basically making people think that this is not really important, nothing major is happening there. So that's basically what agenda setting is. The third major technique is manipulating. It's basically when you take grains of truth and then you twist them and shape them and basically change them beyond recognition. And there are many different examples, contemporary examples, that we can use here. One is my colleague Andrew Fox, who's given the previous workshop in this series, has wrote a paper on how Hamas has manipulated the figures in this latest Israel and Gaza war. That would be one example of manipulation. Another example of manipulation is something that unfortunately I heard a lot of students report to me is happening in their classes. So as I've mentioned, I'm researching the rise of anti-Semitism on university campuses. And for the purposes of that, I've done a lot of one-to-one informal conversations with students. I've done many workshops with Jewish students in the UK universities, and I've done a lot of anonymous surveys with Jewish students in the United Kingdom. It has emerged that some academic staff has been spreading disinformation about what has happened on October 7th and post-October 7th. One example of that, which would fit into manipulating, is people trying to portray October 7th as some kind of revenge for what Israel has been doing prior. This is the manipulation of some non-existent historical context that is basically used by some academics to justify what took place on October 7th, which is obviously absolutely disinformation and quite disgraceful for an academic to do. But the point here is to say you're trying to explain a certain event by manipulating what has happened before, and that's how you spread disinformation about that specific event. So that would be an example of manipulating. Another major technique of disinformation is mirroring. It's when the in-group is committing certain kinds of crimes, but it is accusing the out-group, the targeted group, of those same exact crimes. And that's how you kind of avoid being accused of whatever you are doing. You constantly go around and you accuse the other side of doing exactly the same to try and turn attention towards the out-group and what the out-group is doing rather than towards what you're doing. And then the final technique that is also often happening is denying, where you basically, there is some truth out there, people know the truth, but you go out of your way to deny what is going on. And a good example of this, again, something which a student told me in an informal interview that I've done for my research. She attended a webinar, again, given by a UK-based academic, where the academic in question very explicitly said that no Israeli women were raped on October 7th. That would be denying of the facts, and that would be disinformation. Now, as I say, the list can be broadened, but if you go around looking at if you're trying to find the smallest common denominator to create a short framework for people to understand, okay, these are some of the strategies that people use to disseminate disinformation, this is the list that I have arrived to. But now into the next important bit, which is the mechanisms of disinformation, which is how is this disinformation impacting people's views and behavior? What is going on over there? And in my thesis, I have arrived to 3 broad mechanisms through which disinformation appears to change people's views and behavior. The one is the creation of an explicit belief. The second one is decrease in empathy. And the third one is signaling. So the first one is pretty straightforward, which is people are exposed to some disinformation and they believe it exactly as they've read it. So I don't know, you tell people that no Israeli were raped on October 7th and they just believe it and they go about their day. But this is not the majority of the people. There is a second group, which is far bigger than the first one, where people experience the decrease in empathy. It's not necessarily that they believe all the anti-Semitic or other disinformation that they are exposed to, but the sheer frequency of being exposed to such disinformation numbs their feelings of empathy. It numbs their concern for the group that's targeted by disinformation. So, for example, if someone was extremely targeted by anti-Semitic disinformation, they may at some point stop caring about the well-being of Jewish people. So maybe they don't believe every single anti-Semitic disinformation that they've read or heard or were told, but they've heard so much of it that by this point, they just no longer care. They do not, Helen Fine summarizes it beautifully, they simply no longer care whether those humans get the rights they deserve by the virtue of their humanity, because their ability to feel empathy towards that group is numbed. That's a bigger group than the first one, but still not the largest. In my research, I've realized that the biggest and most important mechanism of disinformation is what I've called signaling, which is people don't believe the disinformation. People's feelings of empathy have not necessarily been numbed, but they believe that everybody else around them believes that disinformation, and they don't want to challenge it anymore. And they start behaving in line with how they believe majority will behave because they don't want to be the black sheep. And this signaling mechanism has actually been tested in Ash's experiments, even back in late 50s, where I'm going to try and explain the experiment because it's really interesting. He basically had 10 people in the room. One person was the actual subject of the experiment. The other 9 were actors. And in the experiment, he has drawn 3 lines to show to the group of people. And those lines looked like this. So one of the lines was very clearly longer than the other 2. He then went around the room. The 9 actors were going first. The 10th person, who was the only subject of the experiment, would go last. And he would ask them, can you please identify the largest line on the paper? The actors were told to purposefully choose the one that isn't the largest one. In almost all cases where because the experiment was obviously repeated, the 10th person, the subject of the experiment, would agree with the majority, despite the fact that the truth would so obviously stare in his face that this is not the longest line. He then went on to explain that there are 2 reasons why people do that, why even when something is so obviously true, they will still side with the majority, even if the majority believes something which is definitely not true. He says that this is because of our tendency to conform, and he separates it into 2 concepts, the informational conformity and the normative conformity. Normative conformity basically has to do with the fact that people don't want to be the black sheep. They don't want to get into a conflict. They feel very anxious that, like, if 9 people believe this is the longest line, I'm not going to be the one to get into a fight about this. And that's why a lot of people just side with what the 9 people in the room have said. In terms of informational conformity, people often believe that the majority knows better. If 9 people say X is true, who am I to now go around and test these 9 people? 9 brains must know better than 1 brain. And subsequently, they side with the views of the majority. And this is actually how I believe disinformation has the greatest impact. People don't feel comfortable challenging disinformation because they believe they will be left alone in that, or alternatively, because they have seen so much disinformation about a specific issue that they start thinking, well, look, if all of these people are saying this is true, maybe those people know better. Maybe I'm the stupid one. Maybe I'm the uninformed one. And the bad news is obviously that this is quite effective. The good news is that there are things you can do about it, because you can burst that bubble and you can show people that the majority doesn't believe disinformation, or at least that there are opposing voices to that disinformation, because people tend to respond really, really well to that. When they see that there is a conflict, they will join in. They will feel that they can say that they disagree with that disinformation. So the good news is now that we know how disinformation works, there are things that we can do about it. Firstly, it starts with us. So we have to know how to recognize it. So now we know what it is. Now we know the strategies that people can use to disseminate it. Now we understand a little bit better, like through what mechanisms it can alter our views, our behavior. But what next? The next thing is, first, we have to modify our own behavior. First, we have to protect ourselves from disinformation. Again, there are many different things that you can do. On the basis of my research, I've arrived to this very short list that should be helpful. So the first and most obvious one is check the source. And when I say check the source, I mean the fact that someone has 50, 150, a million followers on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, the fact that they have a verified account means nothing. That doesn't mean anything. People become viral for all sorts of reasons these days. So always make sure that the piece of information that you're reading is actually written by the person who is a verifiable authority on the matter. So basically, always make sure that you have a reason why you trust a specific source for the information that you've decided you want to believe in. The second step is trust but verify. Something that is usually an academic standard, but I'm worried, given the sheer size and amount of disinformation out there, I believe this should become a principle for all of us. The trust but verify basically relies on triangulation, which means if 3 completely unrelated sources of information are telling you the same thing, that means that it's highly likely it is true. But they actually have to be not connected, which means you can't just go and Google something on BBC and then Google it, I don't know, on The Guardian and then Google it on the Daily Mail and you see, it's all the same. Because more often than not, if you scroll to the bottom of the news, you will see that they're all sourcing from a very small number of media agencies. So if their sources are the same, the fact that you visited 3 different media outlets means nothing. So if you really want to make sure something is accurate, if you really care so much, then you have to triangulate it. You have to find 3 completely unconnected sources of information, obviously legitimate, reputable sources that are saying the same thing, and that means highly likely what you're reading is true. The third thing that you can also do is check the tone. Disinformation almost always wants you to feel an emotion when you read disinformation, whether that's fear, anger, vengefulness, doesn't matter. Almost always disinformation will be using the kind of tone and language that is meant to incite an emotion. So if you're reading an article that's or a tweet or I don't know, a bit of news that's trying to make you feel emotions and it's not like a novel or a romantic movie, check the source, triangulate, because it's likely or at least possible that this is disinformation. The fourth thing is you need to review evidentiary support. So every time someone says X is true, go and see what is the evidence that they're providing. How legitimate is this evidence? Have they sourced this evidence from a legitimate source of information? If there is no evidentiary support, highly likely someone's trying to disinform you or misinform you. But if there are if there is any supportive evidence, you also have to verify that evidence. And then the final step, and I would say quite important one, because I think this is where most of us fail the test, is to watch your own biases. We all have certain political views or ideological positions. And specifically with the rise of social media platforms and the algorithms, we are all in echo chambers. We all live in our own bubbles. And it's very nice to be in a bubble. It's very nice to go and, see 50 people, 100 people, 150 people on your feed basically confirming what you believe. But the fact that 150 people are saying that what you believe is true doesn't always necessarily mean that what you believe is true. So you have to treat all positions and all information equally, whether you personally like them or not. Maybe a person that you follow on Instagram and that you really, really like is someone who sometimes spreads disinformation. That doesn't mean you should stop always following that person or something like that. But basically, the fact that something is shared by the person that you like doesn't mean that it's true. So you have to watch your own biases. And I often advise also, burst your own echo chambers. I often follow people that I disagree with quite a lot. I often read media outlets that I disagree with quite a lot, that promote views that I disagree with quite a lot, because I think it's important to understand the other side, at least know what they think and why they think that, but B, because I get to check my own biases and I get to understand why someone believes something opposite of me, which ultimately I think is the foundation of democratic societies. But I think if you do these kinds of things, in more cases than not, you will protect yourself from disinformation. But now, obviously, there is the next step, which is combating disinformation. So what do we actually do to stop its spreading? And again, many different things that you can do. And here I also want to be, I want to be fair. I think disinformation is spreading faster and in more sophisticated ways than we're not yet able to fully understand it and to fully grasp it. And I'm not able to give you like a, silver bullet here. I'm not able to give you a one size fits all solution that, oh, if you implement it, disinformation will stop. I don't even have a solution that if I was to give one to everybody on the planet and everybody implemented it, I'm not sure it would resolve it. But, that doesn't mean that we're unable to make steps in the right direction. And here is a list. The first one is constructive conversations. I think the world is becoming more and more and more and more polarized. And I think right now it is becoming increasingly difficult, borderline impossible, to have conversations between people who disagree. I think we've seen that in American elections and the whole conversation, the attempted conversation between the Trump voters and the Kamala Harris voters. I think if you go to Germany and you look at, AfD voters, non-AfD voters, like anywhere you go, anywhere on this planet, people are becoming more and more and more and more polarized. And ultimately, I don't think that leads to functional societies. But in the context of disinformation, you are never going to change a person's mind if you don't have a conversation with them. And also you're never going to change that person's mind or move them towards the truth if that conversation starts, you're a racist because you believe this. That's just not how it works. And I understand that there's like a lot of effort that one must make to actually have a conversation with someone who believes something false, but it's worth the try, and sometimes it might actually yield a productive result. And how one does that obviously depends on who you're speaking to, depends on the context, but I always find that asking questions is quite effective. So instead of saying to someone, what you believe is fake, I often ask, why do you believe this? Why do you believe this source? Where did you find this source? So that's sort of how I, in my personal experience and in my professional setting, have found that I am more effective in helping people understand that what they believe is fake. So that's, I think, the first thing that you can do. And I encourage you to do it whenever that's safe, The second thing is, again, it's up to changing your own behavior. It's kind of linked to the watch your own biases, which is basically be critical and be skeptical. So I'm increasingly finding it that, that universe where we've had like reputable mainstream media outlets and we could always rely on them to tell the truth, I think we're now seeing that falling apart. Why that's falling apart is a topic for another conversation. Partly it's because they don't know what they're doing. Partly it's because they are competing with social media platforms where everything has to be out there. It has to be fast. You have to be breaking the news immediately, which means that you don't even have the capacity to actually check and verify what you're sharing. Sometimes, obviously, it's ideologically driven. So I think it's the huge important step to combating disinformation is to accept that everybody can disseminate it and nowhere is safe anymore. Relatedly, the third thing you have to do is you have to diversify your information sources. And it's sort of linked to what I was saying about the echo chambers and the bubbles that we all live in. I think we all have to burst our own bubbles and we all have to be very, very skeptical of everything that we're reading and sort of try and see what the other side reads. Why are they reading it? Is there any truth in that, et cetera, et cetera. The fourth thing, which is really, really key, is for you to share responsibly. As I've said, disinformation always involves the intent to mislead. and maybe you don't have an intent to mislead, but if you share fake news, you are misinforming. And at the end of the day, if a sufficient number of people accidentally shares fake news, the effect basically becomes the same. So whenever you want to click that share button, just make sure that you've done all the steps that we've discussed when it comes to recognizing disinformation. Try and do your best whenever you want to click the share button, try and do your best to know that whatever you're sharing is actually true. Another step, which is becoming increasingly more important, is to check for deep fakes. At the moment, I think it's still pretty easy to identify when an image has been created by an AI. But I think 2 years from now, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that. So again, when you want to click the, in the past, at least like a few years ago, if somebody shares a video or if somebody shares a picture of something, that would automatically mean that at least that thing that you're seeing in the picture, that thing that you're seeing in the video has actually happened. With the rise of AI in the 2 years' time, that's no longer going to be the case. It's already really not the case. People can make a lot of deep fake videos. So if you want to click the share button on a picture or video, remember that you have to check for deep fakes. And then finally, do reverse image search. There are like a bajillion examples that I can think of where one single image would be used in 20 different settings and applied to completely irrelevant contexts. I think in the context of Israel-Hamas war, there has been a lot of images from completely different wars that have been used to portray like something has taken place in Gaza, and that image hasn't been taken in Gaza, nor has the event taken place in Gaza. So the great thing is that Google offers you the ability to use reverse image search. So if you see the news and there is like a very emotional image associated with that bit of news, and you're like, the tone of this news is very emotional, the evidentiary support is not really good, this image is trying to further make me emotional about this topic, go do reverse image search. Maybe it turns out that the image itself is also fake. Again, even if you do all of these steps perfectly and without any mistakes, I don't necessarily believe that this will completely destroy disinformation out there. But I also think that if everybody who uses internet were to do these kinds of things, the situation would improve massively. So yeah, I think this sort of covers all the key stuff that I wanted to cover in this presentation. And I'm happy to give the floor back to you and engage on this topic more. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that incredible presentation, Helena. That was super helpful and insightful information. So I certainly appreciate it. I'm sure our audience does as well. I do have a question already. This is from Talor. She says, I am curious, in your opinion, what are the most compelling policy solutions or government-led solutions on this topic, if there are any? Many of the solutions you shared are individual solutions and tips, which is great. But what are the scalable solutions that you are most excited about or think need to be developed / explored further?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why, and thank you for the question, Taylor, it's really great. One of the reasons why this presentation and in a lot of workshops that I've given, I've focused on these sort of individual solutions is twofold. The first one is because I ultimately think that if all individuals kind of adopt it, the situation becomes far better and decreases the need for a government-led response. The second problem, and the second reason, and I would say a very big problem, is that it is extremely difficult to find a solution that's both good and effective in terms of combating disinformation and also likely to be implemented and supported by the governments and all other relevant stakeholders. I think one big thing that we've come to realize is that social media platforms are basically just private companies that are really, really, really driven by business, and they will do whatever increases their profits. And I think that to try and work a system that they would be happy to implement, even if that meant cost for them, would be very difficult. But some of the directions that I have been thinking about is I think we need proper disinformation training and proper disinformation courses in educational settings. I think we need it in primary schools. I think we need it in high schools. I think we need it at universities. And when I say in education, I don't just mean the students or the pupils. I also mean the teachers and the staff. I think in the aftermath of Israel-Hamas war, it became very clear that like disinformation can and often is spread by people who are in position of authority in educational settings. So I think that's the first step. I think we need like a comprehensive, compulsory curricula on all levels of education. And that can have a lot of benefits that are not just, related to this impact of disinformation that we've talked about, but I think, maybe people here have seen, for example, Adolescence, the Netflix TV show, and just like that whole series of how social media and just engagement on social media impacts very young kids. I think we don't understand how to deal with it, and I think we all need to be educated on it. That's one major step that I believe could work. And then in terms of direct engagement, it's hard because you don't want to restrict free speech. You want to allow for a free flowing discussion and debate between different and opposing views. But at the same time, I think at some point when too much disinformation is spread, I believe it has to be removed. How exactly to draw that line, I think it is hard. But I think at some point, just in the same way in which major media outlets have an obligation to remove false content from their web pages and publish or retract, I think we need to find a similar mechanism for social media platforms as well. When something is verifiably false, I believe that content should be removed. Those would be the two sort of steps that I would have in mind. But I think education is where it has to start first, for all sorts of reasons, both because, as it turns out, a lot of disinformation is spread in educational settings, but also because I think, like, fast forward 10 years from now, 20 years from now, if we don't do something, if we don't create a more media literate generation, the problem that we have right now is going to be 100 times bigger in 10 to 20 years from now.
Thank you for that. I have another question from one of our attendees, and I'm sure we can all relate to this one. Do you think it's productive to even attempt to have a discussion with someone who is at the completely different side politically? I'm not going to change their views, and they aren't going to change mine, and it just escalates into an argument.
Well, yeah. So I often do that. I often do that because ultimately, I think even if you're not gonna, okay, let me structure this. Firstly, I think you should try and avoid the argument, because if the argument just turns into like shouting, that's not really a productive conversation. It's often very stressful, etc. And I think there are ways to avoid it. As I've said, I think the way to avoid it is to always try and approach that person with a question. And I think when I enter such conversations, my aim isn't to change that person's view, because I understand that if someone is really hardcore sitting somewhere else politically, for me, it is really hard that like a single conversation or even multiple rounds of conversation are going to change their belief, which is based on an entire belief system, which is probably has been built for like years or decades, etc. But even if I'm unable to change someone's mind, I still always want to understand why people believe what they believe. And I think that to me is always extremely helpful. And I think if you extrapolate that on like the functioning of a country, it is much better if you have people who disagree, but they at least understand the other side. They can understand where this other side is coming from. They can have a constructive dialogue about, things that they disagree about. Then if there is no conversation. I'm always fascinated by people who believe something which I completely disagree with. I want to know why do you think this? Where is this information on the basis of which you have developed this political opinion? So yeah, I would say it's always worth to have that kind of a conversation. I think it's just important to approach it with a different perspective. So rather than walking into that conversation thinking, I'm going to have this one conversation that's going to change this person's view, walk into that conversation saying, okay, fine, this person disagrees with me, but I actually want to know why. Why do they think what they think? And equally, instead of trying to persuade them that your position is the way to go, turn that conversation into explaining to them why you believe what you believe. And I think from that conversation that's focused on understanding both sides, understanding where both sides are coming from, you're more likely to get some overlaps and some agreement than if you walk into the conversation and be like, I just disagree with everything you're saying, and I'm just going to give you a huge speech about what I believe is better, if that makes sense.
And I'll touch on that too. I find myself in this position a lot because of my role in terms of having to, sometimes it's a room full of people, sometimes it's one-on-one, having to engage with people about topics that are challenging, especially when you're dealing with anti-Semitism. You got thousands of years of it baked into society. Many times it's based on ignorance, not on intent. Then you have the intentional ones too. I mean, it's a complicated space, and you're talking about again, complicated things. And one of the strategies I use, and I'm not the only one, this comes from, I think I mentioned this last time, Professor Elie Wiesel kind of used a similar, so I know I'm in following a good trail when I'm following Professor Wiesel, is, find the people who will listen. There are more people out there who don't know, but are willing to listen, even if they have an opinion, but who are willing to listen. Most of us have opinions, for better or worse, but most of us are willing to listen also. This idea that you've got to turn everyone to, and to pull this a little bit out of the political side of it too. I mean, a lot of times it's influenced by politics, but there's this idea that you're entitled, of course, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Facts are facts. And the idea that has become as complicated as it's gotten. I guess it's, again, one of the main reasons for this program is because there are facts out there, and everyone is responsible for knowing what they are. There aren't two facts to history and all those types of things. Something happened, it happened. And even just a few days ago, late last week, I was on a panel. This is, I think, the first time this has happened to me. It was a room full of people, and one of the other panelists actually started engaging with me, not in a good about, and this was a one-way street in terms of an argument, by the way. I did not want it particularly in front of people, but engaging with me about what genocide is and how it's defined. And I said, there's no conjecture over how it's defined. It has a definition. Yeah, you can look it up, and it was coined following the Holocaust. It's got its own history, and these are words, and there's a word, and there's a definition attached to it. And she just said, yeah, she actually used the phrase agree to disagree when we were talking about it. And I said, I don't think you can do that here. Like, you can't agree to disagree about what the word means. But then the last thing I wanted, Helena, also to your point, is to engage in a fruitless discussion with somebody who wasn't going to listen, particularly in front of over 100 people. And I found myself trying to make sure I remembered my own rule, which is find the people who are listening, even when they have an opinion. And know your facts, and then find the people who are either listening or are willing to listen. Because again, most people already have an opinion or a preconceived notion. I was in a room full of people who had an opinion. In fact, the issue had spawned because somebody had asked a totally valid question, context doesn't matter, but was using Holocaust equivalencies to illustrate his concern about society and saying, this person's like Hitler, and this law enforcement organization is like the Gestapo. And I felt an obligation to clarify that those were people and those are words that have a singularity to them, and points can be, and that's important because the history is important. And that's when I got the pushback. And but the good news is that I remember that the rest of the room, I was hoping in the moment that the rest of the room was actually listening, no matter what each person thought. And that gentleman who asked that question came up to me afterwards, and I said to him, I said, look, I think that you're probably invoking those things because you feel like nobody's listening to you, and you have to bring these, words like Hitler and Holocaust out because then people will listen. And I said, I'm sorry you feel that way, but I promise you that most people will listen without that. We have issues in the world and people will listen. He came up to me and I said, but I don't want you to feel bad. That's not my goal here. I don't want you to think you did something bad to me. I want to help you. I want you to understand how you can communicate these things and why you need to preserve the separation for yourself and for people like me. I'm the grandchild of survivors. I represent the Jewish community, I represent the survivor community, I represent lots of different communities. And it deserves its preservation. He came up to me afterwards and said, that was so helpful. I'd like to bring my wife and my daughter to the museum when it reopens. That mattered a lot more than the actual community leader who was sitting next to me who wasn't going to listen. It's unfortunate, but I only have so much time. We all only have so much time every day. Who do you want to spend it on? Which of those two people do you want to spend it on? And there's a inclination to want to take the challenge on and turn the person who's even more extreme. But we don't have enough time. And we'll find that more people are listeners. And more people came up to me afterwards than just that person. And we made more friends that way. And because I wasn't going to engage in it and I wasn't going to change her mind. And that's not a failure. What is a victory and what is a success is everybody else who was changed in that room. They'll walk away and say, next time I call somebody, I think to call someone Hitler, maybe I'll pull back from that and just say, I don't like the way you're behaving. All of these things, one person at a time, are going to make a difference. But it's getting that education. It's spotting the things that you're talking about, putting that together to then one person at a time start turning this around. Because the victims and the survivors deserve this too. This is one of the main things that caused the demise of so many people. And again, you look at it and say, wow, I wish they had the tools back then. People had the tools to address this. Well, now we do. So we should use them. It was absent before. It doesn't need to be absent anymore.
Mike, for that insight. I have another question. This is from Amelia, and I really appreciate this question because this is something else that we can all relate to. She says, what is your biggest piece of advice to stay hopeful for the future in this current political climate?
Well, I would say history in a way, there have been very, very dark times in history, far darker times than the one that we live in. Sun always came up after the rain. So I think, that's one thing. The second thing is I think, right now we have, social media platforms and it's a tool through which a lot of this disinformation is being spread, but I also think that it is a tool that all of us can use for the forces of good. I think never before have people been as connected as they are right now, and true, a lot of people have abused that and created all sorts of different new problems that we're now trying to deal with. But I think simultaneously, it has given us an opportunity to sort of unite together in trying to create a better world. Like, for example, right now, I have an opportunity to speak to all of you about this bit of research that I've done, these techniques and strategies of disinformation and how it impacts. And I'm able to share some steps that I believe if you were to take them, it's going to create a better media environment around you. You can now go and take it to some other people and some other people and so on and so on. So I think there is a huge potential that came with this ability of all of us to be connected all the time. So that makes me positive. And I really do believe in that thing that, for evil to triumph, what it takes is for good people to do nothing. And I think, that there are a lot of very, very good people in this world. And I think a lot of people are just choosing to stay silent because there is a lot of noise coming from everywhere. But I think if you say to a lot of those people that the time to, wake up or to act has come now, you will be positively surprised. I can give you an example from where I am at the moment. Serbia has been dealing with its fair share of democratic backsliding for the last 13 years. It's all culminated on November 1st, 2024, when a canopy of a train station, recently reconstructed train station, collapsed and killed 16 people at that point. As it turned out, the whole reconstruction was an extremely corrupt deal. And the opening of the train station was never supposed to happen because it was still a construction site, but the government wanted to speed it up for its own political advantageous purposes. And this has started a huge student-led movement that's turned into protests that against the government and against corruption. But as part of those protests, I'm seeing things I never thought I will see in my life. I have seen war veterans apologize to the people who they believe they have wronged by participating in that war. I have seen war veterans admit that they have believed evil propaganda and decided to join the wars back in the 90s. I have seen reconciliation brought between the Bosnian Muslims, the Croats, and the Serbs among this student generation that I never thought that I will see. So, I think that even in very difficult times, if this ability for all of us to be connected is done right, there is a lot of space for optimism.
Mike, do you want to touch on that as well?
Oh, anybody who's ever heard me talk about the lessons knows where I stand on it. It's a great question. Look no further, and it's Helena's point too. Look no further than the history of, like, my grandparents. Many people know that my sort of mantra is, it's like my grandparents used to tell my brother and me, the Holocaust was without a doubt the worst in people, but it was also the best in people. And they taught us to be the latter part any minute we could. And they would illustrate it through what was done for them, what was done to them for the worst, and what was done for them in the best. And they made it their obligation to do great things, in rebuilding their lives. And not, doesn't have to be sweeping, just that, it can be small things every day. We all have these tremendous opportunities, and they're out there. So it's easy when you're somebody who exists because of the greatness of ordinary people, ordinary on paper, as I always say. For those who don't know, the very short version, I exist because non-Jewish people hid my grandparents and were executed for hiding them and never giving them up. So if that doesn't make you optimistic in humanity, that these people in the worst of times could step up for people they barely knew, then I don't know what to tell you. And there's so many great examples from the Holocaust history of Jewish people resisting, the victims being the upstanders at the same time, not just the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and things of that nature, but even remaining who they were from a observance perspective, even to the last second. And so many different other examples. There's tremendous examples of non-Jews doing the same thing. That's what we need for our inspiration. The time was exponentially worse. That's not to say it's not tough now. That's not, nobody's saying that, but it was, they were staring genocide in the face, and still, far be it from us to not do that when life is at least relatively easier and safer.
Amelia says thank you. And I agree, thank you very much. I want to thank our audience for joining us on this beautiful Sunday afternoon, and for Helena for joining us all the way from London, and you as well, Mike. And I hope everyone is leaving this conversation feeling empowered to be smarter about the choices that they make as far as what they consume and believe, and empowered to go out and make the world better. So thank you all for joining us. And I hope everybody can join us for our third and final installment. It will not be next week because next week is Mother's Day. It will be on the 18th of May. So if you haven't registered, please get to our website and do that. And hope to see you online soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.